Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to master the layouts in Android. So now go ahead and open your Hello World app project and then go ahead and open the activity underline main.xml. So here you can see that we already have a layout, a relative layout with lots of UI components in it. First, let me tell you that a layout is a container that can contain other UI components. For example, this relative layout inside this component tree section, you can see contains a text view. We have two edit texts or text fields. We have an image view, a button. So if you switch to the text tab, you can see that the root layout or the container layout is the relative layout. First, you can see the XML namespace. So this value, this attribute is going to specify the identification that this layout is used for Android, not for any other function. And it must always be this value. So XML namespace, Android, we put equal operator, two quotes, and then http:// schemas.android.com/apk/res/android. This is the value that you always use for the XML namespace. And here, just know that the XML namespace is simply for identification that this layout is used for Android, not for any other functions. Then we have the tools. So we have XML namespace tools. Again, we are using this value, but instead we have schemas.android.com/tools. Then we have the layout width and the layout height. So these XML namespace values that you can see here is for the identification that we always use for the root layout. But we have other attributes such as the layout width and the layout height that you see here. And the layout width should always be match parent for the root layout because the root layout is going to contain other layouts. So if I show you the preview here, you can see layout width is not match parent, and for example, it is wrap content, then it is going to also show the component, but it's going to cause problems at first when we want to add the components to the layout. In that case, if the layout width is wrap content, the user may not be able to add the components to the design. For example, I would not be able to add a button to the design when the layout width is wrap content. If the layout width of the relative layout that doesn't contain any components is actually wrap content, then it's kind of hard to add an object or a component to that layout. You might want to, for example, add that component to the component tree section and add it to the relative layout. So now let's go ahead and change it back to match parent. And I always suggest that you use match parent for the layout width of the root container or the root layout. We have the layout height. Again, you can use wrap content here, but because it already has components, you can see that, yes, we can see that some items are not organized and disorganized here. For example, this button is now on this image because we changed the layout height of the root layout to wrap content. If you already have the UI components inside your layout, then adding components to the layout may not cause any problems. So if I switch to the design tab, now you can see that we need to change the position of this image view. So it doesn't allow me to change the position of this image view, as you can see here. So now it did allow me, but sometimes you might have problems with your components inside the relative layout, because remember, relative layout means that your objects or components are positioned relative to each other. So if I switch to the text tab, first let's make sure that the layout height is wrap content, and then let's go ahead and find our image view. So here it is, our image view. It says that layout align parent start true. So align parent start true means that it's going to align our image view to the parent, which is going to be the root layout or the relative layout of this image view. So here we can see that it is showing us an error. We have a red line below this attribute, and it says to support older versions than API 17. So our project specifies that the minimum SDK or the minimum operating system that can run our application is 16. Android Jelly Bean. But it says to support older versions than API 17, you should also add Android layout align parent left true. So first, let me talk about this align parent. So I told you that the parent is referring to the relative layout that contains this image view. So when it says align, it means that it is going to align our image view to the parent start. I told you about the start and end. So start means left on the left to right languages. So for example, if your Android device language is set to from left to right, or if your device's language is left to right, such as an English, then start means from left. Or for example, if your device's language is right to left, such as Arabic, then start means from right. So that's the difference between start and end. But here in our case, because for example, the language of my device is English, then start means from left. So this value is set to true. It is actually aligning our image view to the parent start, to the left of the parent here. So it is true. So in order to solve the error, it said that we should add another attribute, and that is called align parent start. So align parent left, align parent left. So now we need to set this value to true. Now the error is gone. So this is how you work with relative layout. You need to specify that, for example, if you also want to align your image view to the parent end or right, you need to add that feature attribute here. So now here you can see that this is our relative layout, and you're already kind of familiar with the relative layout. I'll talk more about this layout later, but now let's go ahead and create a new layout. Let's go and open the Android view. So open the res folder. We have the layout folder. Right click on it, go to new, and then click on layout resource file. Next, we need to specify the file name. So I am going to name it as master. Notice that your XML file names must be in lowercase letters. You cannot use a capital letter here, because now it is showing us an error, and it says, for example, the D is not a valid file-based resource name character. File-based resource names must contain only lowercase a through z, 0 through 9, or underscore. So we cannot use other characters here. So I'm going to use master underline. So we can use underline here, layouts, underline Android, for example. So now it says that we have something called a root element, such as the root layout. So it says android.support.constraint layout. So constraint layout is kind of new, and we are going to learn it now. So make sure that the root element is constraint layout. We have the source set is main, and the directory name is layout. Let's go ahead and click on OK. Here it is, our layout created. Now I'm going to switch to the text tab in order to make sure that the root layout is a constraint layout. And also we have the layout width that should be in a new line. So you already know about the XML namespace here. We have the layout width match parent, the layout height is match parent. So make sure that you always set the layout width and the layout height of the root layout to be match parent. And then we have the ending tag. So whatever we put between the starting tag and the ending tag of the layout is going to be inside our layout. So let's switch to the design tab now. Notice that inside this componentry section, it says constraint layout. So I'm going to add something called a text view to the layout. I'm going to just drag it here. You can see that if I hover over this text view, we have some empty circles around it. We have one at the top, one at the right, left, and bottom. So first, let me tell you that when you use a constraint layout, we have some icons here. So for example, take a look at this icon that says view options. So here it is for show constraints, show margin, fade unselected views. So make sure that the show constraints is actually checked. And also the show margins is checked so that we can see the constraints that we are going to add. The next icon here is this one, and it is for turning on the auto connect. So this feature is going to add the constraints for you automatically. So you don't have to add the constraints yourself or manually. So this feature is useful when you are already an advanced developer and you know what you are doing with your design. So as a beginner, I suggest that you turn off this feature. So if you click on it, now it is turned on. And if I add, for example, a button to the layout here, it's going to add the constraints for you, but it didn't do it for us now. So sometimes it doesn't work. I told you that constraint layout is new and it might be a little bit buggy. And some of these features might not work. So let me delete this button. But for now, let's just turn off this auto connect feature. The next icon that you can see here, it says the default margin. So the default margin, for example, when you are using a constraint layout, and I added a text view here, and when you add the constraints, it is going to specify a margin for your component. And the default value is 8. If you want to change this value, you just need to click on it and then just type a value here or use one of these values. The next option that you can see here, if I hover over it, is clear all constraints. So you may have already added some of your UI components to your layout and you may have already added the constraints, but you may not actually be satisfied with your design and or how it looks on your mobile device. So in that case, you have an option here, and you can by just clicking on this icon, you can clear all constraints and add the constraints from scratch. The next icon that we have here is the infer constraints. So for example, you may want to put the text view at the bottom right corner here, and you want the Android Studio to infer the constraints for you automatically. So if you click on this infer constraints, you can see that a constraint here, you can see that if I hover over this pulsating little circle on the right edge of this text view, it is now red. This means that a constraint is added. You can see this pointing to the right edge of the layout. And another constraint from the bottom edge of the text view is added to the bottom of the layout, and it is pulsating in red color. So this means that the constraints are actually inferred for you automatically. We didn't add any constraints, but it did infer for us. So it's kind of like the auto connect feature, but I think the infer icon is much more useful according to my own experiences. So the next icon that we have here is the pack. So for example, we have the expand horizontally, expand vertically, that we are going to work on it later. We have another icon. So let's select this text view. And then we have another icon. So if you click on it, we have the horizontally, vertically in parent, vertically in parent. So you might want to play around with these values and see what happens. But for now, we just want to focus on the main functionality of the constraint layout. The next icon, we have, for example, the guidelines here, vertical, horizontal. So we'll learn all about this later. But for now, let's click on clear all constraints. First, we need to design what we want to do with this text view. So for example, I want this text view to be centered horizontally and at the top. Okay, I'm going to put it here. So now I'm going to add the constraints. You can see this little circle that is on the top edge of this text view that is pulsating in green color. I'm going to create a constraint to the top of my layout. So you can see that a constraint is added. And I'm going to create another constraint to the right edge of the layout. So I'm going to select this little circle and just drag the constraint to the right. Another constraint to the left. Now we have 3 constraints, one to the top, left, and right. So inside this attributes section, let's go ahead and click on this icon that says view fewer attributes. Here you can see the constraints. You can see that this area is showing the constraints that are added. So make sure that you select the text view, and here we have a constraint to the top, a constraint to the right, and a constraint to the left. So by default, the value of the margin is 8. If you want to, you can change it here. So now that we have these constraints, let me tell you that now you might ask that this space between the text view and the right edge is not 8. So this value is because of the layout width. So if you change the layout width of this text view to match constraint, now here you can see the margin left and the margin right, the value of these two attributes is now 8. So that's the value here. If you want to, for example, you can change the margin right to be 30 here. Now the space between the text view and the right edge is much more bigger. So now you know the basic idea of constraints. So for example, I can add a button here. For example, I want it to be at the center, vertical and horizontal. And the idea is just to add the constraints. So I need to add a constraint to the right, to the left, a constraint to the, for example, bottom edge of this text view. Here you can see this little circle that is pulsating, and a constraint to the bottom edge of the layout. So here it is, our button. Or for example, I can add not an image view. Let's use, for example, a switch. So let's put it at the top of the button. So here we have the switch, and I can add a constraint to the top edge of the button, to the left edge, right edge, bottom edge of the text view. Or for example, you can add another text view to the bottom left. So here this time, take a look at this attributes section. Let's go ahead and click on view all attributes. And here we have something called constraints. So these are the attributes that are really useful, and we can take advantage of them. So for example, I want the text view to be at the bottom left. So let's find the attribute here. It says, for example, bottom to bottom of. So it's a good attribute. Let's use this one. And here we need to specify that where we want this text view to be according to another layout. So I want the text view to be at the bottom of the parent or the constraint layout. Let's go ahead and click on this drop down and click on parent, and a constraint is created to the bottom. And also we want this text view to be at the bottom left corner. So there should be a constraint to the left edge. So let's find another constraint, another attribute here. So for example, we have left to left of. So let's use this one, click on drop down and then click on parent. So here you can see that it is at the bottom left corner, the text view. So you can play around with all of these attributes and see what happens. This is a very good practice that you, for example, add components to the layout and just for fun, add the constraints and see what happens, or play around with all of these attributes and see what is going to happen, because in this way, by trial and error, you are going to become a programmer. So we are going to learn more about constraint layouts later. For now, I just wanted to introduce you to the constraint layout and the different attributes, and then you can see all of these attributes here. But let's go ahead and switch to the view fewer attributes. So for example, let's select this text view. Here you can see the different kinds of constraints. So for example, we have the left constraint. It says match constraint. If I click on this left constraint, now if I hover over it, it is going to show us another value. It says wrap content. So if I click on it, now it is fixed. So we have different kinds of constraints. The first one is the fixed constraint. That is going to be a hard-coded value for your specific constraint. Because here I am clicking on the width constraint, it is going to specify whether you want the width of your text view to be fixed or not. If you want it to be fixed, you just need to select the fixed constraint. If I click on it now, it is now changed to another type that is called match constraint. And if I click on it again, now it is back to wrap content. So we have wrap content, we have fixed, and we have the match constraints. So remember that. Also, we have the same concept, the same value for the height, fixed, match, and we have also the wrap content. This is a constraint layout, and you can also switch to the text tab and see that all of these constraints, all of these attributes are added here. So for example, we have the layout width to be 0 here, because if I switch to the design tab, you can see that the constraint that we chose for the layout width is match constraint. So it put the value 0 dp for the layout width here, because it is not going to be a hard-coded value, it is going to match the constraint. So here we have the layout height wrap content. We have the margin end 30 dp. So margin end means the layout height, here the value that we specified for this space from the right edge of the text view to the right edge of the layout, this is 30, so this is called the margin end. We have margin left 8 dp, margin right, so the margin right is the same as margin end here, 30 dp. We have margin start here 8 dp, and you can also see the margin left here 8 dp. And we also have the margin top to be 8 dp, the text, and here we have the layout constraint end to end of parent. So layout constraint end to end of parent means that it is going to constrain to the right edge of the parent, but it is going to also consider the margin end and the margin right. And here we have layout constraint start to a start of parent. So it is specifying the constraint to the left edge of the layout here. And finally, we have the layout constraint top to top of parent. So constraint top is referring to the top of this text view. We have created a constraint from the top of the text view to the top of the parent, which is going to be the entire constraint layout. So here you can see first the width and the height, we have the margin values, and then we have the constraints that we added manually. If we wanted, we could also add the constraints in XML code. So next we have the button. First we have the ID, the layout width and the layout height is wrap content. The margin bottom end left and right is 8 dp, so by default this value is 8 dp, but because the layout width and the layout height is wrap content, it doesn't make any difference. But if you change the layout width, for example, to match constraints or the layout height to match constraints, then the margin value would make a difference. And then we have the text. So next we have the constraints. These are the values that we are looking for. We have the constraint bottom to bottom of parent. So we have created a constraint from the bottom of the button to the bottom of the layout. So it is referring to the parent. We have a constraint end to end of. So here end means that from the right of the button, from the right edge of the button to the right edge of the parent. And we have a constraint from the left edge or the start to a start of parent. We have a constraint a top from the top of the button to a bottom of the text view. So you can see that the constraints that we added from the top of the button to the bottom of the text view. So these are the values that we specified here. And then we have this switch UI component, the width, the height, the margin values. We have the constraint bottom to top of. So notice that if I switch to the design tab, let's select this switch. We have a constraint from the top edge of the switch to the bottom of the text view. A constraint from the left edge of the switch to the left of the parent or the constraint layout, from the right edge to the right of the parent, and from the bottom edge to the top of the button. So if I switch to the text tab, first we have the constraint bottom to top of the button. So this is the constraint that we have here. We have a constraint end from the right to end of parent. We have a constraint start to start of parent. And we have a constraint top to bottom of text view. So a constraint we added to the top of the switch and to the bottom of the text view, from the top to the bottom. So next we have another text view that we have here, and we have a constraint bottom to bottom of parent. We have a constraint left to left of parent. So constraint layout is really nice, and if you master this constraint layout, it is going to help you a lot in your programming journey, and you're going to build a lot of beautiful designs in Android. So make sure to use the things that you've learned in this tutorial, because it really helps you. Now I want to switch to the linear layout. So at the end of this lecture, we are going to also have a challenge. So let's go ahead and create another layout file and open the Android view, right? So just open the REST folder and then go ahead and right click on this layout, new layout resource file. So the file name this time is going to be the linear layout. So I'm going to type in here linear layout underline layout underline master or mastery. Now let's go ahead and first let me tell you that it says that the root element is constraint layout. We do not need constraint layout anymore. I'm going to delete this value and use a linear layout. So if you type in here linear layout, the autocomplete feature of Android Studio is going to help you to choose the right layout. So if you're going to use the linear layout, the source set is main and the directory name is layout. I'm going to click on OK. So now that our layout is created, let's switch to the text tab in order to make sure that we have a linear layout here. So here you can see that we have the XML namespace. So let me create a new line for the layout width. So here we have something new that is called orientation. So the orientation is vertical now. I'll talk more about this feature later. And here you can see that the layout width and the layout height is match parent. So let's go ahead and switch to the design tab. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a text view to this linear layout. Inside this componentry section, notice that it says linear layout vertical. So we have a linear layout here, and it is already added at the top here, at the top of the layout. And so, for example, what happens if I want to add the text view to be at the center? So first, let's go ahead and change the layout width to be wrap content. Now, I want the text view to be centered horizontally. So in order to change the position of this text view according to the parent, which is going to be the linear layout, we need an attribute called layout gravity. So I have already taught you about the gravity attribute that is going to specify the position of a child according to its parent. And we have also something else called layout gravity that is going to specify the position of the layout itself. So for example, we have the text view that is going to be a layout for us. And I want this text view to be center horizontal inside the linear layout vertical. Select this text view and search for gravity. And then here we have the layout gravity, open it. Next, we have something called center horizontal. Check this checkbox. Now our text view is centered horizontally inside our linear layout vertical. And for example, if you want to be the text view to be at the right side of the linear layout vertical, I'm gonna uncheck this center horizontal and I'm gonna check the end. So now you can see that the text view is at the right or the end of the linear layout. So here you can see that when I chose the end, it already checked this right attribute for me. So here let me tell you something really important. Because we said that the orientation of our linear layout is vertical, this means that we can only change the position of this text view, that is the child of this linear layout, in a horizontal axis. This means that, for example, here you can see that we cannot change the position of this text view to be centered vertically inside this linear layout. So if you check this center vertical attribute here, it's not going to put the text view, for example, at the center vertical of this linear layout vertical, because its orientation is vertical, and we can only change the position of this text view in a horizontal axis. So let me uncheck this center vertical. So for example, I want this text view to be at the left So I'm gonna check this left here, and it is at the left. I want this text view to be at the center, horizontal. Now it is at the center, horizontal. I want this text view to be at the right. Now it is at the right. But if you check this bottom here, it's not gonna do anything. It's not gonna change the text view to be at the bottom of our layout, because the orientation of our linear layout is vertical. This means that the items are going to be positioned below each other. So here we have a text view. If I add, for example, now a button to the layout, this button is going to be below this text view, not at just beside this text view, but below this text view. This is how the linear layout vertical is going to position your items inside the layout. For example, if I add a switch, now it is going to be at the bottom of this button. I cannot, for example, add a text view beside this button. That is not possible. You can see now the text view is below this switch. If I add up another button, now it is below this text view. So this is how items are organized in a vertical linear layout. So what happens if we change the orientation to horizontal? So now let's see what happens. Let's go ahead and switch to the text tab, and let's change the vertical to horizontal. Now, if you click on preview, you can see that now the items are disorganized. Let's go ahead and switch to the design tab, and we cannot see some of the items because now it is trying to position the items just beside each other in a horizontal axis. But now that we changed the linear layout horizontal, the orientation to be horizontal, now we can go ahead and type in here gravity and open the layout gravity. Now we can, for example, position our items in a vertical axis. So for example, I can select this button and search for gravity and open the layout gravity. And this time, for example, I can check this bottom here. Now this button is at the bottom of the linear layout horizontal. So now inside this component tree section, let's select this text view, and instead of button, let's uncheck this bottom here. And for example, I want this text view to be centered vertical. Now the text view is centered vertically inside our linear layout horizontal here. So for example, I can change it to bottom if I want, or top. Let me uncheck the center vertical and choose the top. Now it is at the top. So now you get the idea that how the linear layout works. So this is a layout that we are going to use a lot in building our applications. So first, let me delete all of these items, all of these UI components that we have inside this linear layout. So I'm gonna select this text view and hold down the Shift key, and then select all of these components and then press on Delete key on your keyboard. Another important point that I want to talk about linear layouts is the concept of the layout weight. So for example, we have a linear layout horizontal. This means that the items are going to be positioned just beside each other. So let's add a text view here. Now if I add, so first let's select this text view and let's set the layout width to be wrap content. So make sure that the layout width of the text view is wrap content, because the next item that we want to add to this linear layout horizontal is going to be just beside this text view. I want to add a button here. So if I just put it here, now the button is going to be positioned at the right hand side of this text view. Now if I add another text view here and another button, so here, so you can position it here. For example, if you want your button to be between this text view and this button, or whether you want your button to be just at the end, you can position it here if you like. So now we have some items here, right? Now, I want each of these items. So for example, we have now 5 UI components in a horizontal axis, in a linear layout horizontal. So here, I want to tell you something really important. First, I want you to assume that the entire layout width of this linear layout horizontal is, for example, 100 dp. Just assume that value. And for example, you want each of these UI components, each of these, for example, text views or buttons, to take 20% of the entire width. So this means that now that we have 5 UI components here, 100 divided by 5 is 20. So this means that each of these UI components is going to take an equal value for the width. So in order to solve this problem, in order to solve this challenge, first you need to assume the entire width. So now we assumed the entire width of the linear layout is 100. Then the next step is to select all of your UI components. So I'm gonna, inside this componentry section, I'm gonna select all of these UI components, and we are going to assign the value 0 for the width, for the layout width attribute. So 0 dp for the layout width. The next step is to give a layout weight. So we said that we assumed that the entire layout width is 100, right? And we have five UI components. So 100 divided by 5 is 20. So now the next step is to assign the result of the divide operation, the value of the width that we assumed, by the number of components. So 100 divided by 5, 20. So the result is going to be assigned to the layout weight. So I'm going to put the number 20 here. So when I put number 20 here, each of these UI components is now taking an equal width that others take. So for example, the width that this text view is taking is the same as the width that this button takes, or this button or the others. Because we are doing some maths here, we are assuming the entire width of this linear layout to be 100. 100 divided by 5 is 20. We set the layout width of each of these UI components to be 0 dp because we want to specify the width of these components according to the layout weight, not the layout width. So that's why we set the layout width to be 0, so that it will not conflict with the layout weight. And then we assigned the result of the divide operation here for the layout weight of each UI component. So if you select each of these UI components, you can see that the layout weight value is 20 and the layout width is 0 dp. So now I want to tell you something else. Assume that the layout width of the linear layout horizontal, the root layout, is 200 now. Okay, so 200. And I want each of these UI components to take an equal width, an equal value for the width. So we have 200 and we have 5 UI components, okay? So we are going to divide the value 200 by 5. Let me open the calculator application. So here it is, the calculator app. I said that we assumed that the layout width of the linear layout horizontal is 200, so 200. And we have 5 UI components, so I'm going to divide 200 by 5, and the result is 40. So this means that the value that we should set for the layout weight of each of these UI components is going to be 40. So now I'm going to select all of these UI components inside this componentry section, and then for the layout weight I'm going to put this time number 40, and let's see what happens. Again, we can see that nothing happened, nothing changed. We can see that the width of each of these UI components, now it is taking an equal value. Okay, so it is all based on your assumption. So for example, assume that the layout width of the linear layout horizontal is 100, and you want this text view to take 80% of the entire layout width. What is going to be the value? So in that case, now that you assumed the layout width is 100, we are going to select this text view and we are going to assign the value 80 as the layout weight. Okay, now we have 4 other UI components. So now that this text view is taking the 80% of the layout width, 20% remained that is going to be unused. So we are going to divide the number 20 by 4 because we have 4 other UI components. So let me open the calculator here. So we have 20% left because we want this text view to take 80% of the layout width of the entire layout, linear layout horizontal. And now we have 20% left. So 20% divided by. So I want these other components, for example, these 2 buttons, this text view and this button, to take the remaining values. So we are going to divide number 20 by 4, and the result is going to be 5. This 5 is going to be set as the layout weight of these other components. So inside this componentry section, select these other UI components, and for the layout weight, this time put number 5 and press an enter key on your keyboard, and let's see what happens. Here you can see that something interesting happens. The text view is taking 80% of the width, and each of these buttons is only taking 5% of the entire width. So the layout weight concept is a little bit tricky and it can be confusing, but if you learn it the way that I have taught you in this tutorial, you won't have any problems regarding this concept. So this concept that I taught you here, I have tested on thousands of students and it works and they have learned it. So I want you to learn it in this way. I want you, for example, to assume the value of the layout width, and then you need to decide each of these UI components, what is going to be the value of the width that each of these components is going to take. And then you can decide what would be the value of the layout weight. So now you may ask that what about the layout height? So the same value, the same process is implemented for the layout height. If you want to specify the layout height based on the layout weight, you need to first assign the value 0 as the layout height, and then you need to just manipulate the value of the layout weight. But here, let me tell you that if you want to specify the layout height based on the layout weight value, then you need to, for the layout width, you need to specify, for example, a match parent or wrap or content, or maybe a hard-coded value. So now let me show you an example, and then it will completely make sense. So go ahead and open a new XML file. So here, right-click on this layout, new layout resource file. So this time the name is going to be layout height weight. Next, the root element is going to be a linear layout. So the source set is main and the directory name is layout. Click on OK. Now we have a linear layout vertical. Okay, so let's drag a button here, and then let's set the layout height to be 0 because I want to specify the layout height according to the value of the layout weight. And then let's find the layout weight attribute. So search for it. So here it is, the layout weight. And then I'm going to assign, for example, the value 100 for the layout weight. So now you can see that our button is taking the entire height of the layout. So here notice that when I set the value of the layout weight to be 100, I didn't change the value of the layout width. It is now match parent, or it could be, for example, wrap content. You could also change it to a hard-coded value. So for example, for the layout width, I can say, for example, 100. That's possible, right? But let me tell you that the layout weight could either be used for the layout width or the layout height. But at the time, you can only use it for one of these attributes. You can either use it for the layout width or for the layout height. So hopefully that makes sense. We are going to use this attribute a lot, and you are going to use it inside your own applications because this is a very great feature of Android. And now it's challenge time. So here it is, your challenge. You are going to design a layout like this, And you are going to use constraint layout, relative layout, linear layout vertical, and linear layout horizontal to design such a layout. So give it a go, and when you are done, make sure to continue watching this tutorial and see how I have designed this layout. So good luck. So I have created a new layout and named it as layout underline challenge. And then in order to run this layout, I have done something in the main activity. So I'm going to open the Android view and go to main activity. Here, in order to run your layout underline challenge.xml file, inside this onCreate method, here we have set content view. So instead of referring to the r.layout.activity underline main, you just need to refer to the name of your layout. So for example, mine is layout underline challenge. Okay, so let me change it back to layout activity underline main. Now let's go back to layout underline challenge.xml file in order to show you how I have designed, how I have created this layout. First, you need to see that the root layout is a constraint layout. So we have a text at the top. I have added the constraints to the top, right, left. Next, we have a button, and here we have some constraints to the left, top, right. And then we have a relative layout inside this constraint layout. So you can see that when I select this relative layout, here I have set an ID to this relative layout, because later when we want to add, for example, the linear layout, we need this ID. I will show you that in a moment. So inside this relative layout, first you need to see that I have added some constraints for this relative layout, top, right, left. You can also use the constraints attribute. So for example, you need to select this relative layout, and you just need to open these constraints, and then you want the top of this relative layout to the bottom of this button. So here you can search for the top to bottom of, and here you can see that I am referring to the ID of this button here. And then inside this relative layout, we have a text view, and then we have a button again. So this button is centered horizontally inside this relative layout. So you already know what is the attribute that we use, but I am going to show you that attribute here. It is called the center in parent, center horizontally in parent. And next we have a linear layout vertical. So I have set an ID for this linear layout vertical to be linear layout V. And I want the top of this linear layout vertical to the bottom of this relative layout. So that's why I set an ID for this relative layout. So I created a constraint from the top of this linear layout vertical. So I have opened these constraints here, and here you can see the top to bottom of relative layout. And I created a constraint to the bottom of the relative layout, a constraint to the left, a constraint to the right. Inside this linear layout, we have a text view and the button. So here you can see that this button is actually centered horizontally, but you can see that this linear layout, the width is wrap content. So if I change it to match parent, now we can see that the button is also, the width of the button is also match parent. So let's change the width of the button to wrap content. Now I want this button to be centered horizontally inside the linear layout vertical. So I am going to go ahead and find the layout gravity, because I want to specify the position of this layout, this button. And then I just need to find the layout gravity and just choose the center horizontal. Okay, and then we have another linear layout, but this time it is horizontal. And then so here you can see that we have a constraint to the bottom of this linear layout vertical, a constraint to the right, a constraint to the left. Inside this linear layout horizontal, we have 10 buttons. We have actually 9 buttons, so number 9 through number 9. And here you can use the same technique that I told you about, the layout weight. So you just need to set the layout width of all of these buttons. So just select all of these buttons and set the layout width to be 0 dp. And then for the layout height, so here we have 9 buttons, okay? So we want each button to take, for example, 20% of the entire width. So now here, let me show you another technique. Instead of, for example, dividing the height by the number of items that we have, I just set the value number 1 as the layout weight of all of these buttons. So in this way, we are specifying that I want each button to have an equal width. So when you set the value number 1 as the layout weight of these buttons, each button is going to take an equal width. Assume that the entire width is 100, and then you can divide 100 by 9. So let me open the calculator application. So I'm gonna say that 100 divided by 9, the result is 11.1. So here we just need to select all of these buttons, and for the layout weight, because it is an integer value, we don't need the decimal value. I'll talk more about this later in Java section of the course. So for the layout weight, just use 11. Now we can see that each button is taking an equal width. So the value after the decimal point is not important. We just need to use the number 11. So hopefully that makes sense. In the next tutorial, we're gonna go ahead and create the final application of the current section, and the application is going to be how old is your pet. So if you have any questions regarding the topics that you've learned so far, please post a discussion in the course, and then I will do my best to answer all of your questions. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.